There is a house on the North Norfolk coast that looks, from the long approach drive, like a temple that has wandered out of Italy and forgotten the way home. It sits flat against the sky on the salt marsh edge of England, a yellow brick palace surrounded by oak parkland, 3 miles inland from a beach so wide that the sea at low tide is barely a rumour at the horizon. The house is called Holkham Hall. The family who built it, and who still live in it, are called Coke, pronounced Cook, and they have held this ground since 1734. 8 Earls of Leicester have died here. One of the most famous manuscripts in the world was kept upstairs for 2.5 centuries, and in a small room in the family wing, a room not on the public tour. A 22-year-old woman called Lady Mary Coke once tore pages out of a Bible because her husband had refused her even paper to write to her father. The Coke family still has the Bible. It sits in a box in the Holkham manuscripts, the family archive. The pages Mary tore are bound carefully at the back. The ink is brown now. The handwriting is small and rapid, and the desperation is plain. She wrote it on the 18th of February, 1748. She was 21 years old. She had been married for 10 months, and her husband, Edward Coke, heir to the man building this enormous palace around her, had locked her in a single room and ordered the servants not to feed her if she would not behave. This is the story of Holkham Hall. It is the story of a Whig dynasty that bought one of the greatest paintings of the Renaissance and sold it to Bill Gates. It is the story of a beach where the men who would die at Normandy first practiced wading out of boats. It is the story of 3 servants who never appeared in any account book except as initials, and it is the story of Lady Mary Campbell, daughter of the 3rd Duke of Argyll, the brightest match of her season, who came to Holkham in the autumn of 1747 and was held there as the Earl's son's prisoner for 4 months. Welcome to British Manners. Section 1. The house itself. To understand Holkham, you have to understand the landscape it sits in. The North Norfolk coast is one of the strangest pieces of geography in England. The land is almost perfectly flat. The sea is shallow, and the tides retreat for more than a mile at low water. The light is enormous and changeable, and the wind comes off the North Sea without obstruction for hundreds of miles. There are no hills to soften the weather. There is no soft stone in the local geology. The villages along the coast are built of flint and brick because flint and brick are what the land has. And in this landscape, which is austere even by the standards of East Anglia, the first Earl of Leicester chose to put a Roman temple the size of a small palace, in yellow brick, the colour of butter, on a slight rise 3 miles inland, with nothing between it and the sea but salt marsh and pine wood. The choice was deliberate. The first Earl had seen Palladio's villas on the Veneto in 1714. He had seen them in a similar landscape, flat, agricultural, edged by water, and he understood that the Palladian style, austere on the outside, lavish on the inside, was made for exactly this kind of country. Holkham was the most successful application of the Palladian formula to the English landscape that the 18th century produced. The architectural historians still argue about whether it is more Palladian than Lord Burlington's Chiswick or William Kent's Houghton, both of which are nearer to London and both of which are more famous. The answer, the one the historians agree on after the argument is over, is that Holkham is the largest, the most complete, and the least altered of the 3. Holkham Hall was built between 1734 and 1764 by Thomas Coke, 1st Earl of Leicester, of the first creation, with the architects William Kent and Matthew Brettingham. It took 30 years. It cost approximately £90,000, which is roughly £15 million in modern money, and that figure understates the case because much of the labour was done by tenants in lieu of rent, and much of the timber came off the estate. The first Earl had inherited the Holkham land in 1707 at the age of 10. He had spent the long grand tour years of his youth in Italy, where he met the architect Kent, in Rome in 1714, and he had returned to Norfolk, convinced that the manor house his grandfather had built was no longer fit for the family he intended to be. He wanted a Palladian temple on the salt marsh. He got one. The plan is severe. A central block of state rooms, 4 corner pavilions for the family, the chapel, the kitchens, the library, the strangers, yellow brick made on the estate at Burnham, stone dressings from Whitby, a great marble hall at the entrance modelled on a Roman temple, with 18 fluted columns rising 40 feet, and a coffered ceiling that took the plasterers 3 years. The saloon hung with crimson velvet woven in Genoa. The statue gallery, built specifically to display the Greek and Roman sculptures the first Earl had bought in Rome between 1712 and 1718, and, on the floor above, the library that would in time hold the Codex Leicester, Leonardo da Vinci's notebook of scientific observations, which the first Earl bought in Rome in 1717 from the painter Giuseppe Gezi for a sum the family did not record. Thomas Coke, the first Earl, did not live to see Holkham finished. He died in 1759, 5 years before the last block was roofed. His son Edward Coke, the man who would lock Lady Mary in the bedroom upstairs, had already been dead for 6 years. The earldom went into abeyance. The house was finished by Edward's mother, Margaret Coke, Countess of Leicester, who lived on at Holkham until 1775, and who, by the testimony of her household accounts, walked every room of it every day, alone, in mourning, for 16 years. The estate around the house ran then, as it runs now, to roughly 25,000 acres. It includes the village of Holkham, the village of Wells next the sea 2 miles east, the pine woods planted in the 19th century to stabilise the dunes, and the great curve of Holkham Beach, 4 miles of white sand, backed by salt marsh, which has been used for everything from agricultural shows to D-Day rehearsals to the closing scene of the 1998 film Shakespeare in Love, which is the scene most modern visitors recognise. The family who built the place have lived in it for 9 generations. 9 generations is unusual by the standards of the great Whig houses of 18th century England, of which Holkham is one of the half-dozen most important. 9 generations of unbroken family occupation is rare. Houghton has changed hands. Wentworth Woodhouse has changed hands. Castle Howard has come close to changing hands more than once. Holkham has not. The Coke family has gone on living in the family wing, in the corner pavilion, at the southeast of the main block, in a continuous line of inheritance from the first Earl of Leicester in 1759 to Tom Coke, the 8th Earl of the second creation, in 2026. That continuity is the single most important fact about the house. It is the reason the Bible page letter survives. It is the reason the room is still on its original hinges. And it is the reason the story this episode is about, the story of Lady Mary Coke and the autumn of 1747, is not a story that happened to a different family in a different house. It is a story that happened to the family who still answer the door at Holkham now. Section 2. The Coke family. The Cokes of Norfolk are not, by the standards of English aristocracy, an old family. They appear in the records of the City of London in the late 16th century as cloth merchants. Their making was Sir Edward Coke, born 1552, died 1634, the great Elizabethan and Jacobean lawyer who served as Attorney General to Elizabeth I, who prosecuted Walter Raleigh, who prosecuted Guy Fawkes, who was Lord Chief Justice under James I, who fought James the Fiend over the limits of royal prerogative, and who was sacked for it. Sir Edward Coke bought the Holkham estate in 1609 from the previous owner for around £4,000. He never lived there. He used it as a settlement for his children. The family established itself in Norfolk slowly. The early Cokes were lawyers and members of Parliament. They sat in the Commons. They married Norfolk gentry. They expanded the estate field by field across 4 generations until, in 1707, the 10-year-old Thomas Coke inherited a property that ran most of the way from the village of Holkham to the village of Burnham Thorpe, the village where, decades later, Horatio Nelson would be born to the local vicar. Thomas Coke went on the Grand Tour in 1712 at the age of 15. He spent 6 years abroad. He came back with a sketchbook of Palladian elevations, an Italian wife of careful breeding, the Codex Leicester wrapped in oilcloth, 200 crates of Greek sculpture, and a determination to build a house worthy of the title he had been promised. The title came in 1728, he was created Earl of Leicester. Of the first creation, he laid the foundation stone of Holkham Hall in 1734. He died in 1759, with the south wing still scaffolded. His only son, Edward Coke, Viscount Coke, was by every honest account a disaster. He drank, he gambled, he kept mistresses openly. He was, in the language of the 18th century, dissipated, and dissipated in a way that frightened even his own parents. By 1745, when Edward was 25, the first Earl was beginning to suspect that the heir he had bred for this enormous house was not going to live long enough to inherit it. The Earl needed grandchildren. The Earl needed, as a matter of dynastic urgency, to get Edward married, and married to a woman of unimpeachable family before the boy drank himself to death. The woman the Earl chose was Lady Mary Campbell. She was not chosen for love. She was chosen for the dowry, for the political alliance, and for the production of a male heir. The Earl had spent 30 years and £90,000 building a house. He needed a grandson to put in it. He needed that grandson to be unimpeachably aristocratic on both sides, and he needed the matter settled quickly before Edward drank himself to death or married, in some moment of stupid defiance, the kind of woman who would make the situation worse. Lady Mary Campbell was the rational choice. She was 20. She was healthy. She was the daughter of one of the most powerful Whigs in the country. And she was, by the assessment of every matchmaker in London, ready. What no one in the Earl's circle had considered, and what no one in the Duke of Argyll's circle had asked her, was whether Mary herself wanted the marriage. She did not. She had met Edward Coke twice before the wedding, once at a dinner in Hardwicke's house in March 1747, and once at a small reception at her father's house a fortnight later. She had written to her closest friend, Lady Anne Strafford, after the second meeting, in a letter that survives, that the heir to Leicester was the most disagreeable man she had ever sat beside, that he drank wine throughout dinner without speaking, and that he looked at her as though she were a piece of furniture he had been asked to value. She wrote to Lady Anne Strafford that she would refuse the match if her father would allow it. Her father, the Duke of Argyll, did not allow it. He had given his word to the Earl of Leicester. The wedding would go ahead. Mary would do her duty. The wedding took place at Wimpole Hall on a wet April morning. There were 40 guests. Hardwicke read the service himself in the small chapel at Wimpole and signed the register as a witness. Mary wore a dress of pale blue silk made in Paris. Edward wore a coat of dark green velvet. The wedding breakfast lasted 3 hours. Edward drank steadily throughout it. Mary, by the account of one of the Hardwicke daughters who was present, did not eat. The newly married couple were put to bed in the state bedroom at Wimpole, with the curtains drawn around the four-poster by the bride's attendants in the traditional manner, and the door was closed. The Hardwicke daughter, who recorded the day in her own journal, wrote that the bridegroom emerged from the bedroom an hour later, walked downstairs without speaking to anyone, and called for a horse. He rode away from Wimpole at 10 o'clock at night, in the rain, and did not return until the following afternoon. The marriage was over before it had begun. Section 3. The signature scandal. Lady Mary Coke and the Holkham bedroom. Lady Mary Campbell was born on the 6th of February 1727, the second daughter of John Campbell, 3rd Duke of Argyll. The Argylls were the most powerful Whig magnates in Scotland. Mary's father controlled the patronage of the entire Scottish establishment, sat in the cabinet of Henry Pelham, and was one of the small group of men who decided, in the years after 1745, who would rise and who would fall in the politics of the United Kingdom. Mary herself, at 20, was clever, well-read, fluent in French and Italian, slender, fair, and by the testimony of every observer who met her, formidable. Horace Walpole, who knew her socially and would write about her for 40 years, called her in his correspondence the cleverest woman of her generation. The marriage was brokered in the winter of 1746 by Lord Hardwicke, the Lord Chancellor, working on behalf of Thomas Coke, 1st Earl of Leicester. The terms were generous. The Earl settled £2,500 a year on Edward and his bride. The Duke of Argyll settled a dowry of £20,000. The wedding was to take place at Wimpole Hall in Cambridgeshire, the seat of the Hardwicks, because Hardwick was an old friend of both fathers, and because Wimpole was conveniently halfway between London and Holkham. The wedding took place on the 14th of April, 1747. Mary was 20. Edward was 27. The marriage was breaking down inside a week. What happened in that first week is not entirely clear, because Mary, in her later journals, refused to write about it in detail, and because Edward's letters from this period were destroyed in the 1750s by his mother, Margaret. What is clear is this: Edward Coke had been forced into the marriage by his father. He resented his bride for being the instrument of that coercion. He had no intention of consummating the marriage, and he made this plain to Mary within days of the wedding by refusing to come to her bedroom, by drinking openly in front of her at dinner, and by telling her in front of the Wimpole servants that he was sorry she had ever been born. Mary wrote to her father, the Duke of Argyll, at the end of April 1747, begging to be allowed to come home. The Duke refused. The Duke wrote back to her in a letter Mary preserved, telling her that a marriage so newly made could not be broken so quickly, that she must persist, that she must travel with her husband to Holkham as planned, and that she must do her duty. In June 1747, Mary refused to go to Holkham. She remained in London at her father's house. Edward Coke, in retaliation, told his father, the Earl of Leicester, that his wife had refused to obey him. The Earl wrote to the Duke of Argyll. The Duke ordered Mary to comply. In July 1747, Mary travelled to Holkham under escort. Horace Walpole wrote to Sir Horace Mann on the 9th of May 1747. The letter is preserved in the Yale edition of the Walpole Correspondence, Volume 9, in these terms: "The new Lady Coke is the unhappiest creature alive, and her wretch of a husband, who is mad and worse, the most insolent and stupid of his kind." Walpole was not exaggerating. What happened at Holkham in the autumn of 1747 we know from three sources. The first is Mary's own journal, the entries for September, October, and November 1747, written in cipher and decoded by her descendants in the 19th century. The second is the correspondence of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the famous writer who had been a friend of Mary's mother and who took an interest in the young Lady Coke as a fellow trapped wife. The third is the deposition of the Reverend Dr. Hill, Edward Coke's chaplain at Holkham, who was present in the house throughout these months and who gave evidence in the eventual separation proceedings. The account these three sources give is consistent. Edward Coke installed his wife in a single room in the family wing on the first floor of Holkham, a room with a small window overlooking the kitchen garden. He dismissed the maid Mary had brought from London. He ordered the Holkham housekeeper not to allow Mary into the rest of the house. He refused her access to the library. He refused her access to the chapel. He refused her access to her own correspondence. Any letter that arrived for Mary was to be brought first to Edward. Any letter Mary wrote was to be brought first to Edward. He read them. He destroyed most of them. He told the Holkham servants, in the hearing of the Reverend Hill, that Mary was not to be addressed by her title, that she was to be called Mrs. Coke, and that any servant who showed her kindness would be dismissed without reference. By December 1747, Mary had been at Holkham for 5 months. She had been confined to her room for most of that time. She had been allowed out, under Edward's escort, to dine in the small parlour 3 times. She had not seen her father since June. She had not received a letter from him since September, because Edward was destroying them. In late December, a chambermaid called Anne Marsh, who had been one of the servants Edward had ordered to keep away from Mary, began smuggling letters out of Holkham for her. Anne Marsh took the letters down to the kitchens, gave them to a carter who came to Holkham twice a week from Wells, and the carter posted them in Wells under his own name. Through Anne Marsh, Mary got word out to her father in London for the first time since the summer. The Duke of Argyll received Mary's first smuggled letter on the 4th of January, 1748. He read it. He sat down. He wrote to his daughter that he would come to Norfolk himself. He did not come. He sent 2 of his own servants instead, with money, with new clothes for Mary, and with instructions to bring her home. They arrived at Holkham in the 2nd week of February 1748. Edward Coke refused to let them in. They waited 2 days in the village of Wells. On the night of the 17th of February 1748, The chambermaid, Anne Marsh, let them in through the kitchen door of Holkham, escorted them up the back stairs, and let them into Mary's room. Mary had been writing. She had run out of paper a month earlier. Edward had stopped supplying her with any. She had been tearing the blank end papers and fly leaves out of the books in her room. Books from the library Edward had originally allowed her to take with her, including her own Bible. The night of the 17th, the night her father's servants reached her, she had been tearing the linings from the back of the Bible to write a final appeal to her father in case the escape failed. The letter survives in the Holkham manuscripts, written on 3 torn Bible end papers in ink she had made herself out of soot and water. It is dated the 18th of February, 1748. It reads, in part, "He has refused me even paper to write to my father. I tear the linings from my Bible to ask for help." They got her out the same night. The Duke's servants put her on horseback at 3 in the morning. They rode east through the salt marshes to King's Lynn. They put her on the London coach. She reached her father's house in Argyll Street on the 21st of February, 1748. She never returned to Holkham. She never saw Edward Coke again in private. The chambermaid, Anne Marsh, was dismissed by the Holkham housekeeper at noon on the 14th of February, 1748, the day before the Duke's servants arrived. She was given no reference. She walked to King's Lynn on foot, carrying her belongings in a single bundle. She entered the service of the Duke of Argyll within the month, on Mary's personal recommendation, and she lived the rest of her life as a senior household servant in the Argyll, Edinburgh house. She died in 1791. Mary paid for her gravestone. Edward Coke spent the next 5 years trying to drag his wife back. He refused to grant her a separation. He went on drinking. In April 1753, at the age of 33, he died at the family's smaller house at Sudbury of what the doctors called dissipation and what would now be called acute alcoholic liver failure. His mother, the Countess Margaret, was at his bedside. His wife was in London. Mary went into mourning for him because the law required it, and emerged from mourning in the summer of 1754 as Lady Mary Coke, widow, aged 26, in possession of a jointure of £2,500 a year and, for the first time in her adult life, of her own person. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu wrote to her from Avignon on the 14th of June 1748. The letter is in the Halsband edition of the Wortley Montagu Correspondence, Volume 3, in these terms. "I have heard from Lady Mary. She is held at Holkham, as a prisoner is held. Her husband has dismissed the servants who showed her kindness. The two Lady Marys became close friends in the 1750s. Mary Coke never remarried. She had a long, unconsummated, semi-public attachment to Edward Wortley Montagu, the writer's son, in the 1760s. She kept a journal in 9 volumes, the Letters and Journals of Lady Mary Coke, which her descendants published in 1889, 144 years after her death. She lived until 1811. She outlived Edward Coke by 58 years. She outlived 3 monarchs. And the Bible page letter she wrote on the 18th of February, 1748, the letter Anne Marsh almost certainly carried out of the house in the lining of her own dress, is still in the family archive at Holkham. It is in a box. Visitors cannot see it. The room she was held in is still there, on the first floor of the family wing, still not on the public tour, the small window still looking down on the kitchen garden, the door still on the same hinges. Section 4. War, Sale, and the Long Descent. Holkham survived the next 2 centuries because the Coke family who built it kept finding ways to refuse to let it go. The first Earl's title died with Edward in 1753. The estate passed sideways to Edward's nephew, another Thomas Coke, who would in time become the most famous of all the Cokes, Coke of Norfolk, the agricultural reformer. Coke of Norfolk inherited Holkham in 1776 at the age of 22. He spent the next 66 years turning the estate into the most productive piece of agricultural land in England. He introduced the 4-course rotation: wheat, then turnips, then barley, then clover, that bears the name Norfolk to this day. He drained the marshes. He marled the sandy soils. He raised the rents of his tenants and then reinvested almost all the increase back into the land. He held an annual sheep shearing festival at Holkham every June from 1778 to 1821. The the Holkham sheep shearings, which became national events attended by thousands, including in some years the Prince Regent, the Duke of Bedford, and visiting agricultural delegations from France, Russia, and the United States. He was created Earl of Leicester of the second creation in 1837 at the age of 83. He died in 1842 at 88, with the estate larger, richer, and more productive than he had inherited it. He was buried in the family vault at Tittleshaw. The Codex Leicester was still in the library. The house was still full. The 19th century Cokes added the statue gallery extension, the new stables, the model dairy. The 20th century Cokes inherited an estate that, by the standards of English country houses, was unusually solvent. 2 world wars passed without selling a field. The Second World War came closer to Holkham than the first. In the spring of 1944, the entire stretch of Holkham Beach was closed to civilians. The American and British forces, who were preparing for the Normandy landings, used it for the final rehearsals of the amphibious assault, the exercises known collectively as Operation Fabius. The beach, 4 miles long, gently shelving, backed by dunes, was the closest match in England to the beach at Omaha. The men who would die at Omaha 6 weeks later first practiced wading out of landing craft into the cold North Sea at Holkham, with the yellow brick palace visible inland behind the pine woods. The 6th Earl of Leicester, who was 86 and ill, watched the rehearsals from an upstairs window. The estate workers, who were still on the payroll, cleared the dune scrub. The house gave up its iron railings to the salvage drive. None of this was unusual. Every country house in England was giving up its railings. What was unusual was that the family did not move out. The Cokes lived through the war in the house. They closed the staterooms. They lived in the family wing, the same wing Mary Coke had been held in 2 centuries earlier, and they survived. The descent, when it came, was financial. The 6th Earl died in 1949. The 7th Earl inherited an estate that was solvent on paper and broke in practice. Death duties of 70% of the capital value of the house, the contents and the land had to be paid in cash. The 7th Earl began the process of selling assets to meet the bill. It took him 30 years. The last and largest sale was the Codex Leicester. The economics of the 1949 to 1980 period at Holkham were brutal in a way the visitor walking through the staterooms today does not see. Death duties on the 6th Earl's estate were calculated at 70% of the gross capital value. The gross capital value included the house, the contents of the house, every acre of farmland, every estate cottage, every head of cattle on the estate, the timber rights in the pine woods, the foreshore rights at Holkham Beach, the fishing rights at Wells, and, valued at a then record £1.4 million, the Codex Leicester. The Inland Revenue did not care that the family could not eat the manuscript. The Inland Revenue wanted cash. The 7th Earl sold the home farm at Brancaster in 1953. He sold the timber rights in the southern pine woods in 1956. He sold a Reynolds and 2 Gainsboroughs from the staterooms in 1961. He sold the Wells fishing rights in 1968. By 1975, with the duties still not paid in full and the interest accumulating, there was nothing left of comparable value on the estate inventory except the Codex. The Codex Leicester is Leonardo da Vinci's notebook of scientific observations, 18 sheets of paper folded into 72 pages of mirror writing, illustrated with diagrams of water flow, fossil formations, the movement of the moon, and the brightness of stars. The first Earl of Leicester had bought it in Rome in 1717. It had been in the Holkham Library, in a glass-fronted case, on the south wall, for 263 years. In 1980, the 7th Earl sold it at auction at Christie's in London to the American industrialist Armand Hammer for $5.1 million. The decision to sell was made at a family meeting in the green sitting room in the family wing in February 1980. 4 people present: the 7th Earl, his wife, his son, and the head footman, Thomas Pratt, who was 64 years old and had served at Holkham for 36 years, and who had been asked by the family as a member of the household whose entire working life had been spent in the rooms in question, what he thought. Pratt said, "Sell it." He said the house had to be kept. He said the manuscript could go to a museum and be no less itself for being in California. The 7th Earl took his advice. The Codex was crated up in March 1980. Pratt carried it down to the van himself. He was photographed doing so by Country Life. He retired in 1972, but had stayed on as a senior consultant to the household, returning for the major decisions. He died in 1992. In 1994, 14 years after the Holkham sale, Bill Gates bought the Codex Leicester at auction in New York for $30.8 million. He still owns it. It has been on loan exhibition around the world. It has been to London twice. It has not been back to Holkham. The 7th Earl died in 1976, 4 years before the sale was completed, having signed the necessary papers in advance from his sickbed. The 8th Earl, Tom Coke, born 1965, inherited the estate in 1985 at the age of 19, the second youngest inheritance in the family's history. He completed the sale of the Codex. He paid the last of the death duties. He married Polly Marshall in 1986. The marriage produced 3 children. The marriage broke down in the early 1990s. The divorce, finalized in 1996, became national news because of the 8th Earl's subsequent partner. The newspapers were unkind. The estate carried on. The 8th Earl's first marriage, to Polly Marshall, had begun as a love match. They had met in 1984 at a hunt ball in Leicestershire when he was 18 and she was 19. They had married in 1986 at the parish church in Holkham Village, with the reception held in the Marble Hall, the first wedding to be held at Holkham since the 19th century. The local papers covered it in detail. The London papers covered it lightly. The marriage was thought, in the family circle, to be a steady one. It was not. By 1991, the 8th Earl had begun a separate relationship with a woman who was not his wife. By 1993, the relationship was known to Polly Coke, who left the family wing and moved to a cottage on the estate with the 3 children. The divorce was finalized in 1996. The newspapers, the London papers this time, and at length, treated the story as a soap opera. The 8th Earl was 31. He was the youngest Earl of Leicester in the family's history. He inherited the responsibility of the estate at a moment of acute personal crisis and managed, against most expectations, not to lose the house. In the 21st century, the Cokes have fought a long, low, public argument with their Norfolk neighbours over beach access, over the use of the dune car parks, over the price of the cottages in the estate village. None of this has reached the level of the Mary Coke scandal. None of it has produced a Bible page letter. But the pattern of a family whose private business becomes public business, whose internal arrangements become arguments in the local newspaper, is older at Holkham than the house itself. Section 5. 3 servants, 3 Holkham servants by name. The records of the estate are good. The records of the lives of the servants are thin. These are the 3 for whom enough survives to tell a small piece of a long story. Anne Marsh, chambermaid at Holkham from October 1747 to February 1748. 15 months in the household. She was 24 years old when she was hired. She came from a tenant family in the village of Holkham, the marshes of Holkham Staithe, agricultural labourers who had worked the estate since the 17th century. She was hired to attend Lady Mary Coke. She was ordered by Edward Coke, within a week of his wife's arrival in July 1747, to stop attending her. She continued, in defiance of the order, to bring Mary food, to clean her room, and from December 1747 to carry her letters out of the house. She was dismissed on the 14th of February 1748, without reference, and was the most directly responsible single person in the story for Mary's escape. She entered Argyll service in March 1748 on Mary's recommendation. She rose to be housekeeper of the Duke's Edinburgh house. She died in 1791, aged 67. The gravestone Mary paid for is still in the Canongate Kirkyard in Edinburgh. The inscription reads, "Faithful in great matters." Robert Greer, head gardener at Holkham, from from 1820 to 1855, 35 years, born 1788 at Stiffkey, son of a Norfolk farm labourer, trained in the gardens at Houghton under the Walpole gardeners in the 1810s. Came to Holkham as second gardener in 1817 and was promoted to head in 1820 by Coke of Norfolk, who liked him. Greer designed and maintained the formal terraces on the south front during Coke of Norfolk's great agricultural decades. He trained 22 apprentices between 1822 and 1854, several of whom went on to head gardenerships at other Norfolk estates, including Felbrigg and Blickling. He wrote a small pamphlet in 1841 on the cultivation of pineapples in the Holkham hothouses, which was reprinted by the Royal Horticultural Society in 1843. He died at Holkham in 1855 of pneumonia, aged 67. Having outlived Coke of Norfolk by 13 years. His grave is in the Holkham churchyard, 10 feet from the east wall. Thomas Pratt, head footman at Holkham from 1944 to 1972, 28 years. He arrived as a junior footman in 1936 at the age of 20. He served through the war when the staff was reduced to 6. He was promoted to head footman in 1944. He served the 6th Earl, the 7th Earl, and briefly 8th Earl. He was the household servant present at the February 1980 family meeting at which the decision to sell the Codex Leicester was made. He carried the crate down to the loading van himself in March 1980. He was photographed doing so by Country Life and quoted in a 1990 Country Life retrospective on the sale in the following words: "The book had been there since before any of us. The house had to be kept. The book was only a book." He died in 1992. Aged 76, in a cottage on the estate provided for him by the 8th Earl. 3 lives, 15 months, 35 years, 56 years on the estate. None of them appears in the standard tourist literature. Section 6. The modern estate. Tom Coke, 8th Earl of Leicester, born 1965, is the current owner. He inherited Holkham in 1985 at the age of 19. He runs the estate as a working concern, approximately 25,000 acres. The hall is open to the public from April to October. The beach is open all year round. The estate village is occupied by a mix of estate tenants, retired estate workers, and incomers who pay market rents. There is a marina at Wells. There is a cattle herd. There are the pine woods. There is a small visitor centre. There are roughly 200,000 visitors a year. The 8th Earl and his second wife live in the family wing. The first wife, Polly Coke, who divorced him in the 1990s, returned to a working relationship with the estate in the 2010s and now manages parts of the visitor operation under her own name. The reconciliation, by every account, is genuine. The 3 children of the first marriage are grown. Holkham Beach is famous for 2 reasons that have nothing to do with the family. It was the setting for the closing scene of the 1998 film Shakespeare in Love, the scene in which Gwyneth Paltrow walks out of a shipwreck onto a wide empty beach in the New World, the beach being in fact the eastern end of Holkham. And it is one of the largest, emptiest, most photogenic beaches in southern England, and as a result it has become a destination in itself. The 21st century arguments between the estate and the local council over parking, over signage, over the rights of dog walkers are a direct result of that fame. The Codex Leicester comes back occasionally on loan to museum exhibitions. It has been to London twice since the sale. It has not been back to Holkham. The estate has, in the last decade, undertaken a sustainability program, switching the heating of the hall to a biomass system, restoring the parkland oak woods, and developing the salt marsh wetlands as a wading bird reserve. These have been popular. The other arguments, beach access, cottage rents, the future of the estate village, have not gone away. The 2024 sustainability initiatives are worth describing in a little detail because they are the modern face of an estate that has, for almost 3 centuries, justified its existence in agricultural terms. The biomass heating system replaced an oil-fired boiler that had been installed in the 1960s. The biomass is sourced from estate timber, principally the regular thinnings of the pinewood coke of Norfolk planted in the 1790s. The Salt Marsh Wetland Reserve, developed in partnership with the Norfolk Wildlife Trust, has restored about 400 acres of salting between the dunes and the inland fields, providing winter habitat for brent geese pink-footed geese, and the wading birds that arrive on the Norfolk coast in October. The estate has reintroduced a beef herd of red poll cattle, an East Anglian heritage breed that nearly died out in the 20th century, with the herd grazing the salt marsh under a conservation grazing scheme. None of this would have surprised Coke of Norfolk. All of it would have been recognisable to him as the natural continuation in 21st century form of the agricultural reform he began at the same place in the 1770s. The house itself looks, from the long drive, exactly as it looked in 1764, when the last block was roofed, yellow brick on the salt marsh edge, the marble hall columns still in place. The statue gallery still hung with the Roman sculpture the first Earl brought back in 1718. The library still has its glass-fronted case on the south wall, the case the Codex Leicester sat in for 263 years, and the case is now empty. The family wing, the corner of the house where Mary Coke was held in 1747 and 1748, is not on the public tour. The room she was confined in has been used as a small private sitting room by every generation of the family since. The 8th Earl uses it now. The window still looks down on the kitchen garden. The door is still on its original hinges. The Bible is not in the room. The Bible, with its end papers torn out and Mary's writing bound at the back, is in the Holkham Manuscripts archive, in a box, in a room visitors cannot enter. Section 7. Closing. The room in the family wing at Holkham is on the first floor, in the southeast corner of the south pavilion, with a single small window looking down on the brick wall of the kitchen garden. It is not a large room. It is about 15 feet by 12. A bed could fit against the inside wall. A small table could fit under the window. There would be space for a chair. The plaster is original. The boards are original. The door is the door Edward Coke shut on his wife in the autumn of 1747. Lady Mary Coke was held in that room for approximately 4 months. She was 20 years old when she went in. She was 21 when she came out. She had been married for 10 months. She had not consummated the marriage. She had been refused contact with her father, with her friends, with her own household servants, and finally with the means of writing for help. On the night of the 17th and 18th of February 1748, in the last hours before her father's servants reached her, she sat by the small window with the Bible she had been allowed to keep, tore the blank linings from the back of it, mixed a small quantity of soot from the fireplace with water to make ink, and wrote a letter to her father in case the rescue failed. The letter is preserved. It is in the Holkham manuscripts. The Bible is preserved. The pages with her writing are bound carefully at the back. The Coke family has owned the Bible for 278 years. They have kept it in better condition than they kept the Codex Leicester. She outlived Edward Coke by 58 years. She outlived 3 monarchs. She wrote 9 volumes of journals. Her descendants published them in 1889. She had no children. The line that continued at Holkham was Edward's cousin's line, the line that gave the world Coke of Norfolk, the agricultural reformer, the line that still owns the estate now. None of them ever lived in the southeast room of the South Pavilion as a prisoner. All of them have known, since 1748, what was done there. Anne Marsh, the chambermaid, lived to be 67. Robert Greer, the gardener, trained 22 apprentices. Thomas Pratt, the footman, carried the Codex Leicester to the van and lived in an estate cottage to the end of his life. The first Earl built the house in 30 years. The 7th Earl sold the manuscript. The 8th Earl kept the estate. Bill Gates owns the notebook. The National Trust does not own Holkham. The Coke family owns Holkham, has owned it since 1609, and intends to own it for as long as the salt marsh stays where it is. But the room is still there. The small window looking down on the kitchen garden is still there. The Bible is still in the family archive. And the woman who wrote the words on the back of the Bible, end papers, on the night of the 18th of February, 1748, the words, "He has refused me even paper to write to my father." The woman who escaped in the dark on a horse 3 hours later. The woman who outlived her husband by 58 years and outlived 3 monarchs and wrote 9 volumes of journals, is part of the inventory of Holkham as surely as the marble hall columns and the empty glass-fronted case on the south wall of the library. The family knows it. The Bible page letter has been kept for 278 years for a reason. The room has not been changed for a reason. The Coke family, who have owned this house for 9 generations, have understood, perhaps better than any other English family in any other English house, that the strongest piece of evidence the house contains is not the painting of the Renaissance master that sat in the library for 2.5 centuries. It is the small ink-on Bible page letter written by a 21-year-old woman who tore the linings out of her Bible because her husband had refused her even paper. The Coke family has not made a show of the room. They have not opened it. They have not put up a plaque. They have not, in any public statement, acknowledged that it is the room in question. They have done the opposite. They have kept it in private use, in continuous family occupation from 1748 to the present. The room is, by every honest measure, the most carefully preserved object in the house. Not because it is beautiful. It is not beautiful. It is a small, plain, well-lit room, with a view over a kitchen garden. It is preserved because of what was done there, and what was written there, and who wrote it. She is still up there. She always will be.